It is now my pleasure to call on Sylvia Nasar, who will deliver the commencement address. Dr. Nasar.
Thank you. I'm so honored and so touched to be here today. I discovered the story of John Nash, the most remarkable mathematician of the second half of the 20th century, over a decade ago. A Beautiful Mind is a drama about the mystery of the human mind. It's a love story. It's a classic survival story. People often ask me what I took from it. And of course, in coming here today, I've been thinking about what you, the class of 2012, might take from it. Maybe it's this. Maybe it's that you can't write the last chapter of your own story. Maybe you can't even write the next one. You can't imagine how things will turn out. You don't know what's possible. It's not over until it's over. At one point in the movie, when it looked as if things really were all over for Nash, Alicia takes John's hand and places it over her heart and says, "I have to believe that something extraordinary is possible." And more often than we think, something extraordinary is possible. John Nash was born in the coal country of West Virginia on the eve of the Great Depression. He arrived at Princeton University, the center of the mathematical universe, in 1948, another recession year, as a first-year PhD student. A one-line letter, admirably concise, preceded him. "This man is a genius." John Nash was conspicuous at age 19 for his movie star looks and his Olympian manner. His conversation had a stilted, ornamental quality. He avoided classes as a matter of principle. Perhaps like some of you, he was rarely seen opening a book. On those few occasions when he was spotted in the library, it would be lying on one of those long oaken tables with his arms folded under his head, staring up at the ceiling. The other students thought he was weird, haughty, spooky, even for a mathematician. Another graduate student, a mathematician, described him as obnoxious, immature, a brat, but added that what redeemed him was a clear, logical, beautiful mind. In his very first semester, Nash invented an ingenious topological game that Parker Brothers later manufactured under the name of Hex, and that you can play online today. Around the mathematics common room at Princeton, the game, which was played with black and white go stones on a rhombus covered with hexagons, was simply called Nash or John. As you know, play is as essential to creativity as work. Nash proved a beautiful and surprising theorem showing that the player who makes the first move in the game can always win. But his life story proves that in life, as opposed to in the game, outcomes are not determined by the first move or the second move or even the 50th move. In life, one thing can lead to another, but only if you have faith, only if you stay in the game. Before I studied economics, I majored in literature. Plays, novels, poetry are full of stories about meteoric rises and catastrophic falls. there are very few stories, much less true stories, with a genuine third act. But John Nash's life had such a third act. And that third act is what drew me to his story in the first place. I was an economics reporter at the New York Times. I heard a rumor that he might be on a short list for a Nobel Prize in economics. He was not exactly a household name, but anyone who studies economics these days learns some game theory, a branch of mathematics that uses games like poker or chess to analyze competition and cooperation, whether among companies or individuals, nations, or animals. And everyone who studies economics in graduate school learns the so-called Nash equilibrium. I made a few phone calls. I learned that before John Nash had turned 30, he was already a rock star in the rarefied world of mathematics. He had made astounding contributions, not just in game theory, for which he got a Nobel, but in far-flung and very deep areas of pure mathematics. He was about to be promoted full professor at MIT. He had married a gorgeous physics student, Alicia. He was looking forward to the birth of a son. And then the curtain fell. Not long after Fortune magazine singled him out as the most brilliant of the younger generation of American mathematicians, Nash's beautiful mind betrayed him. One morning, he walked into the common room at MIT carrying a copy of the New York Times. He remarked to no one in particular that a story on the front page contained encrypted messages from inhabitants of another galaxy. Soon afterwards, he pulled aside one of his doctoral students and handed him an intergalactic driver's license and offered him a seat on his newly organized world government. As his behavior became more and more bizarre, he was hospitalized against his will at McLean Hospital outside of Boston. And there, the psychiatrists quickly came to the conclusion that he was suffering from the most devastating and disabling of mental illnesses, paranoid schizophrenia. A Harvard mathematician who visited him at McLean asked, "How could you, a mathematician, someone who has devoted your whole career to rationality, how could you believe that aliens from outer space were recruiting you to save the world?" Nash looked at him and answered, "These ideas came to me the same way my mathematical ideas did, so I took them seriously." The inability to distinguish between delusion and reality, between voices in one's own head and one's thoughts, is, of course, part of the tragedy of schizophrenia. We now know that schizophrenia is a real disease, like diabetes or epilepsy. But when Nash got sick in 1959, shortly after his 30th birthday, the science was primitive, and so were the treatments. Mental illnesses were supposed to be the fault of bad mothers. Schizophrenia was almost universally considered a life sentence without parole. And tragically, for many people, it is. Another visitor, also a mathematician, recalled, "Robert Lowell, the poet, walked in manic as hell. There's Mrs. Nash sitting in the lounge, pregnant as hell. Lowell looks at her and starts quoting the begat sequences in the Bible. And there was John, very quiet, almost not moving. He wasn't even listening. He was totally withdrawn. I focused mostly on his wife and on the coming child. I've had that picture in my mind for years. It's all over for him, I thought. And for a very, very long time, it did look as if it was all over for Nash. By the mid-1980s, the ideas that he had had in his 20s were becoming influential in fields from economics and geometry to biology and political science. But Nash, the man, the human being, had been all but forgotten. The more influential his contributions became, the deeper he sank into illness, poverty, and obscurity. He was hospitalized several times, always against his will. He was subjected to extreme and extremely futile treatments. He was unable to work. As the years passed, he became a mute, ghost-like figure in red high tops and mismatched plaids, scrawling mysterious numerological messages on the blackboards of the mathematics building at Princeton. Students knew him only as the Phantom of Fine Hall, and outside of a small circle of mathematicians of his generation in Princeton, most people who had heard of him or who knew his work, including me, simply assumed that he was dead. And then, after 3 decades, after 30 years, something extraordinary happened. Freeman Dyson, the theoretical physicist and writer, used to see Nash every day at Princeton's Institute for Advanced Study, but had never heard him speak or interact or seen him interact with anyone. And Freeman said to me, it was beautiful. Slowly, he just somehow woke up. On the day that the Nobel was announced, I was in the newsroom, idly scrolling through the morning's wire stories, and I can still remember the almost out-of-body experience when I saw Nash's name in the story from Stockholm. I hadn't wanted to write the story a year and a half earlier when I heard the rumor, because lots of people are shortlisted for Nobels who never get them, and writing about his tragic life in the New York Times under those circumstances I felt would be an invasion of privacy. But now that he had the protective mantle of a Nobel, I knew that I had to get that story. To me, the notion that someone who had been lost for so long could be found again, that someone who had fallen as far as John Nash had fallen could come back again, struck me as extraordinary, like a Bible story or a Greek myth or a fairy tale. Nash, I learned, survived those lost decades largely because Alicia and a handful of loyal friends in the mathematics community refused to give up on him, kept believing that something extraordinary was possible. And of course, most of our lives aren't going to encompass the extraordinary elements of Nash's genius, madness, reawakening, a Nobel Prize. But for all of us, it's like that old REM song, there is a second, a third, a fourth, many chances, but only if we keep trying, if we see the opportunities, if we stay in the game. In an extremely, extremely minor way, I feel my own journey has something in common with this principle. Until I actually became a journalist, at around age 35, nothing in my life pointed in that direction. English was not my first language. I was, unlike you, a C student. I wasn't expecting to have a career at all. When I graduated from college in a recession year, the future head of the Port Authority of New York said, "Sylvia, there are thousands of girls like you pounding the pavements of New York, looking for a job. I hope you can type." A dozen years later, in the worst recession since the Great Depression, I still hadn't published anything or really done much of anything. I was a single mother with 2 young children who had just gotten herself fired and whose only hope was that the telephone company might hire me to calculate their long-distance rates. Of course, it's absolutely fantastic to discover your passion, hone your talent, accomplish great things, be recognized when you're still in your 20s. And I know that, like Nash, many of you will experience that. But for some of us, maybe for most of us, it can take a few acts. It also takes some faith. I'll never forget a letter I got at the Times after the story ran. It was scrawled on this crumpled, dirty piece of orange paper in a smudged envelope that never would have gotten past the Times newsroom after the anthrax scare. And it was a letter from a man who turned out to be a one-time rising star on the Metro desk of the New York Times until he too was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia in his 20s. And since then, he had adopted the name Berkeley Baby and lived on the streets of Berkeley, California, in the vicinity of the university, a sad and tattered figure, not unlike the Phantom of Fine Hall. And what did his letter say? It said, "John Nash's story gives me hope that one day the world will come back to me too." John Nash was about my age when the world came back to him, and after he got the Nobel, he talked about his second career, about the problems that he hoped to solve. When he and Alicia, who remarried, joked about having a second take on life that's just like the movies. Mathematics is, of course, mostly a young man or young woman's game, yet even in his 80s, John Nash is still thinking about those big mathematics problems. And in the last frame of the PBS documentary about his life, John looks straight at the camera and says, "I'm not thinking anything crazy, but there are different possibilities. I don't know what the future holds exactly, even if it's not such a long future for me." Well, your future is a lot longer. And sure, the job market's not great right now. It may take a few acts, a few starts to find your footing. But starting out was always hard. And in the last 160 years, and now I'm speaking as an economist, in the last 160 years, at least 44 college classes, including Nash's, including mine, probably including those of your parents, at least 44 classes graduated in a recession year when jobs were hard to find. But every one of those classes, including the Great Depression generation, not only wound up with more opportunities, but actually achieved more and lived better than their parents' generation. So have a little faith. Keep doing what you have learned to do here at Niagara. Keep learning, keep searching for your truly original idea. Keep believing, like John and Alicia Nash, that sometimes something extraordinary is possible. Thank you and good luck, but from what I've heard about you today, I doubt you'll need much of it.